Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you will hear part 3 of my conversation with David Hubert, Associate Provost for Learning Advancement at Salt Lake Community College. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. There's one more thing that I'd like your take on as well, which is there's also been an undercurrent, from mainstream, lots of mainstream, and it doesn't matter from which political party. It goes from New York Times as much as it's from everyone else, who have been even challenging, perhaps not the concept of college, but how colleges, what the value of college is today, and value of liberal arts education. I think there's no secret that you and I both are big fans of it. So, I want to hear your take on, well, why is it that there is this narrative out there that says, college is a waste of time, or that, you don't want to be, you said, so you teach political science. You don't want to be in political science. You should only go to college if you are going to go into engineering or STEM or something.
Right.
Right. What do you think about this narrative?
I see I see 3 lines of narrative. One has to do with the expense of college, and higher education really needs to come to grips with the plain fact that the cost of college has outstripped the inflation rate for decades. Why is that? How is that money being utilized? That's a narrative that we have to come to grips with. And if we don't come to grips with it, our state legislators will do it for us. So that's one thing. And so when people think about, oh, do I want my kids to go to college? It's so much more expensive now than it was when those parents were contemplating going to college. So that's one thing. The other thing is just the utility of the credential, which I think in most respects is largely intact. When you look at the job market, there's still a tremendous need for people with nursing degrees and bachelor's degrees of business and so forth. I think there are some changes that are happening in some fields. Computer science comes to mind, where there appears to be kind of a fragmenting of the credentials that you might need to succeed in that field. And then the third narrative is the much more ephemeral and intangible benefits of higher education. The liberal education, the general education foundation, the preparation for being an engaged citizen, the kind of breadth of knowledge that you get from higher education that allows you to live what I think is a much more rewarding life, right? It's much more, it's a much better experience to go through life knowing what's going on around you, and being able to read and being able to appreciate the arts, and understand the scientific challenges that we're facing in terms of climate change, or what's going on with the Webb telescope. That's super awesome. Those 3 narratives, sort of the ephemeral, the less tangible aspects of higher education, the cost of higher education, and then the credential benefit, are doing some kind of weird dance, it seems to me, right now. And I think people are seeing the high cost. They're not appreciating the intangible aspects of higher education, and they're only focused on that credential and what it can get me as an individual. So we lose sight of the public benefit of a highly educated population. I mean, that's the way I see it. I'm not providing you any answers. I'm just sort of giving you an insight as to how I think about it.
I think it's really well articulated, and I think that some of the relationship, unfortunately, is one that has a downward spiral effect, because when you start to feel like that, well, there isn't enough value on this, then it allows your, state to cut the budget.
Right.
And by cutting the budget, the cost actually goes up. And the reason is you have to now use tuition dollars to cover the budget that they just cut.
Yeah.
And I know that community colleges, traditionally has always been, has a huge amount subsidized, by the states, and so were many state colleges. But we have known that in the last, let's call it maybe couple decades, many state colleges no longer operates that way.
Right.
Many state colleges have to charge a higher tuition, but also have their state budget cut to a huge amount. Some state colleges essentially operate as a private college. They just have the state's name on it. I
Right. They
mean,
have
we have
very, very little state support, and we
very,
have
very
quite a,
low. Yeah,
we have quite a bit of support,
mhm,
obviously from our state, but
sure.
it's not as much, I think, as we should have. And we are very dependent on tuition dollars, and we're cognizant of every time that we raise tuition, are we cutting students out of the
Yeah,
possibility of going
sure.
to higher ed? So I feel very glad that our president and our institution has been very mindful of not raising tuition
Yeah,
to try to chase those dollars.
right. Because that's what almost most of the time happens, is
Hmm.
that you basically, it costs a certain amount of money to run this institution. And I don't want to argue that it's run in the 100% efficiency. There's probably areas where you go, well, that's, why are we wasting money on this? Or there's some bureaucracy that might get in the way of some of that as well. So it's not all, 100%, rainbow and sunshine. But there is sort of, in the bigger picture, this idea that when the states, when we, when our when we don't see education as a right, when we see it as sort of a, it's nice to have, and if you work for it, you can get it. And then suddenly that sort of translates it to, well, hold on a minute, then why do we have to fund this?
Yeah.
And we don't have to fund it. And you, by the way, especially that it happened over a very long time, right? So every time they cut another 5%, an institution goes, well, we either got grant money, we either raised money, from wealthy alum, or we were able to get tuition, or if you happen to have been one of these very lucky schools that had an endowment and that did really well, and we were able to
Yeah.
draw from that, we were able to cover the deficit of the 5% that we got cut this year. And then another 2 years later, another 5%, and you did the same exercise. Suddenly, it's almost kind of like, well, at some point, it's sort of this downward spiral,
Well, I think the ultimate result of the downward spiral is the transition from seeing education as a public good, as a benefit for the
Mm.
common, for everyone in society, to it being a private good, right? You get yours and I'll get mine, and we don't owe each other anything. Um, and I think that mindset is ultimately self-defeating. I think, if you look at the prosperity of the United States in the 60s and 70s and 80s, for instance, it was a direct result of the expansion of higher education following World War II.
And I think that we basically kill the upward mobility opportunities. I think that there is such thing as an upward mobility index of each country, and the United
Yeah,
States is not doing all so well, even though it's always been what's called the American dreams.
right.
That's what American dream is about. Is that you have this unlimited potential to upward mobility. Um, Laws of
And
large numbers.
we want a higher education system that can facilitate upward
Right,
mobility rather than one that simply
right.
cements existing social
Right,
arrangements.
right, right.
Yeah,
And I don't want to say that it's gone away completely, because the American dream still exists for lots of people. So if you go and watch like
sure.
Shark Tank or whatever, you go, oh, it's happening live and well. it's live and well, but for a much smaller number of people than it used to be.
Hmm.
And that's it's something that actually is a little bit of a myth right now, for folks from from different places to sort of think about the opportunity to it's this idea of, if you are from a family that doesn't have resource, you are more likely than other people than people who have resource to stay in the next generation of family without resource for your children.
Right,
um,
right.
and that's really the effect of this. Sort of, it's a private service. Like, if you can afford it, sure, you can continue
Yeah.
this really fabulous, way of getting fulfillment in life in
And
all
that's
kinds of
one
ways.
of the reasons. It's one of the reasons why I really enjoy working at a community college. Right, we are the first rung on the ladder of higher education. We keep our tuition down. We serve a great deal of first generation students. We have small class sizes. We do not have any large lecture halls, so you get to know
That's
your
awesome. Yeah.
you get to know your faculty. So we really are. We really exemplify kind of that America as a land of opportunity. That's one of the super things about working at a community college.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned a few times already, I don't want to not talk about this, OER.
Mm.
So tell people what it is. Open educational resources. What is it? How are you doing it? What do you see? How do you see that moving forward in education?
So, open educational resources are an attempt to lower costs for students and improve access for students by making the educational resources, so for instance, things like textbooks, openly licensed so that students can access them for free or very, very low cost. We have had an OER initiative at Salt Lake Community College since, I think, 2013. It was started by my colleague, Jason Pickavance, who's another associate provost. It's now in my area, but we recently calculated that since 2013, we have saved students over $20 million in textbook costs alone through our OER initiative. And our initiative encourages faculty to either adopt existing OERs that other folks have written and that are widely available, or to create our own. And before I even knew what OER was, I was involved in creating content for my students that I would release to
Mhm,
them for free.
mhm,
Um, I have since developed that into my own textbook. So I teach introductory U.S. government and politics, and I was always uncomfortable with the textbooks that existed. They're expensive. They're overly jammed with concepts that I don't think students necessarily need, and so they can't figure out what's important and what's not.
mhm.
And I kind of thought that they were written in a style that I didn't appreciate. So um, I was supported by my institution several years ago, right? Actually, just before the pandemic started, um, to take my existing materials and put them together. And really, I really worked, harder on this than I did on my PhD dissertation. I have to tell you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I worked for a year and a half, um, and I wrote a U.S. government textbook. It's called Attenuated Democracy: A Critical Introduction to U.S. Government and Politics. And it's been the most rewarding thing I think that I have done academically um, in my career. So it was put out during the pandemic. In the first year, 6,800 students used it. And then the second year, 29,500 students used it. So now I'm into the third year. It's being adopted at institutions around the country. And then I'm reaching out to those faculty who are adopting it and creating a resource site and sharing assignments between the folks who are using it, so that we have kind of try to develop a community of users. And it's just been very, very rewarding. And the students love it. It takes a very down to earth, critical approach to U.S. government. It tries to balance kind of our natural cynicism about the way the American political system works, and tends to serve those who are economically already doing quite well. The system tends to serve them at the expense of ordinary people, but it balances that cynicism with an approach of, if ordinary people organize and work hard, they can get the system to address their needs, and they
Right.
have in the past. So I get a lot of students coming out of my class who say, I really like that approach of, you're telling me what's wrong with the system, but I don't just throw my hands up and feel like it's helpless. I feel like I know how to go out now and run for office, start an organization, join an organization, campaign for a politician, really affect change. So that's been very rewarding to me, is to see student reactions to the textbook.
That's amazing. And for those who are interested in checking this out, whether it be just to check out the material and learn about OER, or to actually use it with the students and, etc., where would they go to do this?
So they can go to the online indices of OER textbooks. So if you look for OER textbooks, there's lots of sources for that. You can also go to our site, and you go to slcc.pressbooks.pub, and then you can search our catalog there. It's just called Attenuated Democracy. I think if they probably Googled that as a
Yeah.
textbook link, they'll find it as
And,
well.
and it's just $200, or
No,
how
it's
much is
free. It's
it?
free.
It's free. So
It's
you are
openly
saying that
licensed.
all of these textbook used, and you did not rake in millions of dollars
I did not rake in
in
millions of dollars. I did get some support from my institution to
Mhm.
write it, but now it's out there, and
Yeah.
I keep updating it. So much happens in our political system that
Yeah.
I have to keep updating it. So that's a bit of a chore, but it's a rewarding one. It keeps me fresh.
Yeah. And that's the one of the things about, and I actually find this to be really interesting that you had it's not only for the cost, but it's also for the contents and the style
Yeah,
of the textbook that existed before. And I would even sort of sometimes, kind of feel like that, um, kind of going back to the costs, of being a college student.
hmm,
To me, the idea that textbook could, with OER, you can make it freely accessible, which is amazing. But before that, even buying used books, etc., it costs so much
oh, so
money
much. Yeah,
to do that it feels like and here's the amazing thing. You have just proven how the economics of it doesn't have to be like that, right?
right.
If greed and profit wasn't part of the sort of the part of the equation, and the drive and the incentives of why these textbooks existed in the first place,
Yeah,
right? If it existed because you wanted people to be able to learn from it, um, it turns out that it's possible, and it turns out that the cost of doing so, especially with technology today, is relatively inexpensive. I'm sure someone had put up the resource to host the book
sure.
and the contents, etc., but is nowhere near the type of expenses that incurs if we each of those 29,000 or however many thousands of students are paying $100, $200 for that book.
Yeah, it cycles back to the free range theme we're developing here today. Uh,
Right.
right. That
Yeah.
knowledge should be free, especially I think for
Mhm.
students.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an amazing service, David. I imagine that all the people who are listening or watching this would like me to thank you for it,
Oh,
on their behalf.
thanks.
Um, and of course, on all of the, for all of those students that you were able to help. But I really hope that more folks get onto that, um, that opportunity to publish things in, for in OER. It just as OER because it can change already some of the narrative of this. Because imagine if we can do that, we just cut down the expenses. As much as we were talking about budget before, right?
Yeah.
For how institutions have to manage that, we are now helping students manage their budgets too, by cutting down this part of the expenses. So suddenly the cost of attending college in total actually just gotten lower because of this.
Yeah, and I think in addition to providing that sort of service to students, it's also enriching and revitalizing for faculty to get involved in developing or
Yes.
adapting existing open educational resources. And that's the nice thing about this is that there are now several introductory US government textbooks that are
Mhm.
openly licensed, just as there are for many disciplines. And the neat thing about it is you can mix and match. You can say, oh, I like these chapters from this one and these
Mhm.
other chapters from that one. And because they're openly licensed, you can meld them together and write your own introductions to those chapters as a faculty member. And that, particularly for community college faculty who are often not engaged in the kind of research that R1 university faculty are, I think that's an outlet to plug you into your discipline and
Mhm.
revitalize your knowledge as you engage in open content development or adaptation.
Yeah. I think it's a fantastic way to. I mean, I feel like that it is, it also changes, and I like that it's actually called resources and not textbooks, because I
Yeah,
think it changes the way that we even have this relationship with a textbook. You know, it feels like to me always before that, I don't know. As a student, I was not that studious in terms of, I was not the student that would do all of the additional reading. In
yeah.
fact, I don't even know if I do the required reading. I do the absolute minimum. I was a good student in many other ways. I just wasn't into that. In some ways, I think naturally I'd always thought, look, the textbook isn't the kind of thing I want to do for fun. It's not.
Right.
It's so and but then to a certain extent, I always wonder, why is that? Why is it that this book that everyone's supposed to read, it should be millions of people read this thing, and it's going to be helping us so much, but are the most boring, dry, and like
Yeah. They don't
unengaging,
they
difficult to digest, content,
they don't have to be. But
right?
unfortunately, a lot of textbooks are. I
Yeah,
strove to make mine very accessible and very readable. So
yeah.
I think
But that
students
in and of
appreciate
itself
that.
already, I totally agree. That in and of itself is already, a huge part, because, just to be able to get the language to be understandable and accessible by more people
Hmm.
is one of those things. And I do think it's interesting because in many academic sort of writing and publishing, you almost want to make it less accessible because it makes you sound more
Sound
smarter,
smarter,
sound more
yeah.
educated. You're using bigger words. You are using more, concepts and theories that people hadn't heard yet. So now you have all these footnotes and all, and
And
it's
in
a
many
little bit of
cases,
a
that's
show off, right?
yeah. In many cases, that's exactly what students don't need. I mean, obviously,
Right.
you need to introduce them to the academic language of your discipline, sure,
Mhm.
but I
Mhm.
think you can go overboard with that. And in my discipline, in political science, students come with a great deal of frustration. I
Mhm.
think they pick up
Mm.
on the fact that the system is not working for ordinary people, but they don't have the vocabulary to articulate that particularly well.
Mm.
So that's one of the things that I stress is really trying to help them understand the system and be able to put it in their own words, what they dislike about it and what they would like to see changed.
And that is beautiful. Um, so, David, are there any things that I feel like we can talk for another couple more hours, but are there any like big topics that we didn't cover that you feel like that we would have missed the boat if we didn't talk about?
I don't know. I'll just say that I love my job. I love my situation. I walk to
Yeah.
work. I walk back home from work. I feel like I'm working with fabulous people, and I'm making a contribution in students' lives. And I'm really looking forward to my first class on Monday night, uh, because I feel like I benefit so much from interacting with students, and I miss being in the physical classroom. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I am grateful to have had this conversation with you, and I'm sure that many of the listeners are too. You are a real breath of fresh air, and it's still got that organic grass fed feel, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
So I think that's
yeah.
good. And just a couple of plugs for you. You probably won't ever do this, but I wanted to do it for you because you're just such a great person to be around. Because if they don't come to attend community college, Salt Lake Community College, they won't get to meet you necessarily. But
Yeah.
that's not actually true. They get to meet you sometimes at different conferences. So please look out for those. But also, obviously, your OER, they can read your voice and your ideas in your book, which we'll put a link to, to the show notes of this podcast or YouTube video or wherever this goes. And then in addition to that, any institute coming up that you'd want to let people know about if they want to learn from you and have the opportunity to work with you.
Well, I've had the great fortune of being a faculty at several of the AAC&U institutes, particularly the Institute on General Education and Assessment, and the Institute on High Impact Practices. Those typically take place in June, and they'll be advertised by AAC&U probably in the February time period, so institutions can sign up for that. And then I'm also involved in the ePortfolio Institute and the OER Institute, which are year-round virtual.
Mm-hmm.
They started in the summer, and they'll go through next summer. So, but if you go to the aacu.org, you
And
can look for.
look under institutes. There are
They look under
many
institutes,
institutes,
yeah,
yeah,
and
that
they
you're
just do
involved with.
great work at AAC&U.
They really do, and they employ just the best around the world. Folks like David Hubert and folks like Pablo Avila,
Yeah,
who are all the people who are having a lot of practical know-hows as well as the theoretical and being able to sort of put that to use. And if folks who are listening who are in institutions where you feel like I need a little external jolt to start some initiative or to start an idea, look into these resources because I think they're tremendously helpful and can save you a lot of headache, time,
yeah,
and money probably.
indeed, yeah.
All right, well, David, it is so great to speak to you again, and I can't wait to see you again in person. And I hope it won't be too long. When that happens. But meanwhile, stay well and stay healthy. And I hope you have a wonderful first class next week and a good semester. And I look forward to getting updates from you in the future, especially once you get through to the prison program, because that sounds like another, great program. And I feel like a lot to be learned from that too.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jeff. It's been a great time talking with you today, and my best to you and your family.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
This concludes our conversation. To hear our next episode, be sure to subscribe to Digication Scholars Conversations on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. The Digication Scholars Conversation series is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative e-portfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for tuning in.